Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of The Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by two of my wonderful colleagues from the Orb and the Institute of Race Relations. They are Mr. Bheki Mahlobo. Bheki, how are you today?
Hi, Nick. I'm well. And yourself? Thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, no, great to have you on. I think this is your second time on the show, and we're very happy to have you
Yes,
back.
I'm becoming a regular main caster in the TV show called The Daily Friend.
Soon your face will be plastered on every building in the nation.
Yeah.
And we also have Mr. Hermann Pretorius, who was with us yesterday. Hermann, how are you? Are you still recovering from yesterday's show?
Yes, emotionally, I'm still recovering from several things, primarily yesterday's show. But broadly speaking, I mean, I'm just envious of Bheki, just generally, because I've never been told my face is going to be on a Daily Friend billboard. But, you know, I mean,
well, because
I'll take it on the chin and I'll just drink a bit more.
To do so, Herman, would probably doom South Africa to eternal slavery under socialism.
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's fair enough.
Anyway, not that I can speak much myself because I do have a hideous, disgusting beard, as some of our listeners have pointed out. No, but actually, this is a tangent.
The thing about beards, Nick, is that they grow on you.
Be thankful, listeners, that you don't have to share an office, and even virtually, with Herman, because this never stops. But I actually wanted to just mention something about my beard, actually, and that's I decided that I wasn't going to shave until lockdown was over. It's a little exercise, and as you can see by the state of my facial hair, lockdown is not over, and it hasn't been over for more than a year.
it's a little cheat sheet for the state of the country. You know, yes. just chaotic and losing its way.
Indeed. Anyway, let us get down to the serious business of today. Well, on first glance, this doesn't sound like a very serious thing because it sounds like such a ridiculous idea. But it is serious because it's coming, of course, from former President Jacob Zuma. Now, we wanted to talk about this yesterday, but we didn't have time, and that is that Jacob Zuma, in a meeting with the ANC's top 6 officials, the notes of which were leaked to the public by someone involved in that meeting, said that, you know, he's really been thinking about it. And he kind of has come to the conclusion that the Constitutional Court, he says, how can 11 people have, quote, so many powers? And that the will of the people was being subverted by the Constitution. He said that the Constitution was using the judiciary was using the Constitution to arrest the will of the people. This is an interesting conclusion to come to, and it seems to coincide a lot with his current legal predicaments. Herman, what do you make of Zuma's claim that the Constitution subverts the will of the people?
Well, I mean, you know, he was bound to say something true at a point in his political career, and we have now arrived at that point. The Constitution does subvert the will of the people. It indemnifies, or it makes it impossible for Parliament to be fully sovereign and for the representatives of the people to do whatever they want. That is the purpose of a constitution, is to be, you know, sovereign. Otherwise, we are left in the situation of parliamentary sovereignty that we had under apartheid. Now, a conversation about parliamentary sovereignty is actually a complex one because I actually am quite sympathetic to the argument of parliamentary sovereignty. I do think that there's some merits to it. But we must face the fact that in South Africa, we had a very perverse form of that because we didn't have a universal franchise. So the parliament that was sovereign was a white parliament that could do whatever it wanted to. And then the idea of a sovereign constitution really was to ensure that the pendulum doesn't swing in the other direction, that another group can do what the National Party did by simply, capturing the majority of the instruments of power and then just having their way with the country. And that's the point of a constitution is to be restrictive. That is why I fundamentally believe something like the judiciary is a small c, or is a small c conservative constitutional entity, because it is there to be a brake on just the will and whims of the people. That's the point of constitutional checks and balances. If you did not have that, then you would have no legal certainty, because the law could just change every other day. You would have the ability of a parliament to just start doing what its predecessor did in terms of having no check on its power. And I think it's quite disgusting that this is somehow seen as a bad thing. The development of a restrictive, inhibiting constitution is the most important development of modern statehood. And I think it should be welcomed. It should be protected. Our constitution isn't flawless, but it's bloody good in many respects, and it gives a framework for liberty if we are willing to fight for it. But the bizarre thing is, just as a last point, if we do the maths on this, yes, 11 people have a lot of power. Okay. But let's then say, okay, 11 out of 50 or 60 million, that's not very representative. But it's not statistically much better than 490 people being representative of 60 million. If you get 11 possible points out of 60 million, that's a terrible score. If you get 490 out of 60 million, that's also a bloody terrible score. So if you're going to say, no, 11 people having this power, which is a perverse interpretation of the Constitution as it is, but let's go with it. If you say 11 people have this power, it should rather be 490 people having this power. You're really just playing around with a few, figures after the decimal point of saying, no, this marginally increased percentage of the population should have more power than this marginal percentage of the population. So it's, firstly, yes, does it subvert the will of the people? That's its purpose. Two, does the argument bear water in terms of, were it not for the Constitution, 11 people or a small coterie of people wouldn't have control of the country? No, you idiot. I mean, I really don't want to call a former president an idiot, but he really has earned this one.
I don't know if it's so much idiocy as it is just malicious self-serving. But I wish Zuma wore a hat often like Bheki Mahlobo, so I could put on my Zuma hat and go to you, Bheki, and say, but surely, why do we need these breaks on the will of the people? Isn't the point of democracy that the people make the choice and have to live with the consequences of their actions? So if they vote in a bad law, then that's their will and they should suffer with it.
Yeah, so Hermann touched on something very important here, that the Constitution acts as chains that restrains the government and prevents the government from becoming a draconian government. And I believe Zuma's comments there reveal a lot about some of the thinking that I see in the ANC, really, that with the policies that they try to implement fundamentally seek to weaken those chains. We've had an example of this where essentially the ANC was unchecked in terms of its powers. This was the year 2020 with the hard lockdown. You see, we saw ridiculous amounts of laws being implemented, and the encroachment on the average life, the average South African lives. And that negatively impacted on the well-being of the South Africans. We saw millions of South Africans pushed to poverty because of that. So we have quite a fresh example of what the ANC could do with unchecked power. And I think it's very important that we have checks on majority rule, essentially where we would have, for example, a large proportion of the population is in favor of a policy that would be detrimental to other groups of people. I don't think that would have a very positive outcome. And that's why we have the Constitution to sort of prevent that. So I think this highlights the point that the Constitution and its chains is linked to the outcomes that we see happening in the economy, in the sense that if you have a draconian government, we'll have massive starvation, massive poverty in the country.
Right. And I think, of course, one of the things that people don't often necessarily appreciate about our Constitution is that some of the things, the terrible policies like expropriation without compensation, because of the constitutional framework that we have, which protects property rights, even if in a fairly limited extent, this forces the government to have to change the constitution, which is always something that's difficult politically in any country, whether it's a dictatorship or a free nation. Changing the constitution often has unpredictable political consequences. So the fact that that clause exists is very good for proponents of liberty, because it gives us a chance to fight back. And also the constitutional structure creates all these slowing pieces of the process. So they can't just push through the law by decree like they did with banning alcohol. They have to go through consultation with the public and things like that. And that allows the forces arrayed against the bill to organize, to prepare themselves, to make arguments in the public square, and to convince people that it's a bad idea. And that's another great benefit of the Constitution and the will and its subversion of the will of the people, because the will of the people may at any one time be one thing and then a week later be something else. It's one of the problems with it. Hermann, anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, I think we really run into the nitty-gritty of the social contract here if we really start talking about the will of the people. Because, I mean, a minority, I don't, what was it? There are 35 million, roughly, South Africans of voting age. Of the 35, about 27 million registered to vote. Of the 27, I think about 17 million pitched to vote. So if you're going to start talking about the will of the people, it's a very, very vague concept, and it cuts to the heart of the social contract. When has the will of the people been determined? Now, I think the social contract is a very useful construct. I think since its introduction as a mechanism of thinking about government power, it has done more good than harm. It has ensured that there's this idea of reciprocality, that in terms of contract, you get rights and obligations. And because there's a perceived contract between the government or the state and the people, both get rights and obligations. And what has really made democratic rule different from historic feudal rule, pre-social contract, is the idea that the citizen can demand that the government or the state should take their obligations more seriously, or really could make hay out of that. So when we go into the will of the people, I mean, it's a philosophical question as to when that has been decided, whether it exists at all. Now, I suspect it exists, but I can't prove it. And I think there's a very, very dangerous thing to be said here if we on both directions, either saying, yeah, the Constitution is useful, the Constitution is perfect. But what I've in the last year specifically have found very frustrating about South Africans who are, moderate, middle, small C conservative, classical liberal South Africans, is a disdain for the Constitution. And I think that's dangerous. The Constitution, people have often encountered this issue, but what did the Constitution do to stop it? Well, nothing. It's not an actor. If the best way to explain the Constitution is the rules of the road, or those little railings on the sides of Tempen bowling things, it's not going to give you it's not a safe journey or a good score on the pins, but it's there to restrict the chaos, to ensure that the worst things can still happen, but only under very extreme pressures and circumstances. So when we talk about the Constitution, don't see it as hagiographic, godly text, but do see it as something that has been immensely useful, and that is a codification of a social contract that has, in my view of history, done more good than ill. So when you start karanging, when you start disentangling that tapestry, be very, very careful where you end up.
No, that's very well said. I like the analogy of the bowling pin lanes. All right, we must move on now. So I will introduce our next topic here, which is that South Africans today are going to be experiencing a petrol price increase. And this increase will see the price of fuel now about a third of all money you pay whenever you buy a liter of petrol will be tax. So for every liter of petrol, you pay fuel levy, road accident fund levy, customs and excise, demand side management levy, and there's some other small levies as well, which usually amount to about 1 cent per litre, so they're not very important. And the government's desperate need to raise money is leading to more of these. So Bheki, please enlighten us how we should look at this petrol price increase.
This petrol price increase is really another measure of the government to increase its revenues. This is mainly due to the fact that we've added about 20% of our debt last year in just 1 year, which has never happened before in South Africa's history. So what's happening here is that the state is seeking ways in which to essentially reduce the gap between government expenditure and government revenue. The difference between the two adds onto our debt and acts as an anchor on future economic growth. And really and truly, what this petrol tax increase is just speaks broader to the theme of citizens' abuse that we see South Africans face on a daily basis. They see electricity prices increase on a yearly basis well above inflation, but yet still pay for load shedding, a declining quality of the service delivery. And this will largely impact the low-income earning South Africans because transportation as well as like taxi, low-income individual South Africans use taxis to go to work, as well as food prices. To transport food also needs petrol, and the increase in petrol prices will impact that directly. So this is just another way of citizens' abuse where they're paying high amounts of taxes for lower service delivery.
Right, and it's not just petrol, actually. Also paraffin, which is used by some of the poorest people in the country to light their homes, is going up by 35 cents per litre, at least partially due to these tax increases. So it's literally the poorest of the poor are paying some of the costs of these tax increases. Hermann, your thoughts on this petrol price increase? I thought the whole purpose of having a price control on energy products was to make sure that they remained affordable for the poor.
Yeah. Without retreading some of what Bheki said, I think on an earlier answer, the year 2020 really taught us a lot about how the government views the economy. And it's a quite uneducated view. It looks at the economy as a machine that you can pause it, you can switch it off. It's segmentable, that you can change this without affecting that. The problem is the economy is really closer to an ecosystem, because an ecosystem is essentially the biological environment in which organisms make choice to promote their survival. And if that sounds very close to an economy, it's because it is. It is really this complex web of if you tell the lions they can't eat for 3 weeks, it's not just that you're going to have slimmed down lions in 3 weeks. You will have consequences of immense magnitude that you cannot really quantify and foresee. One of the very good instances of Ecosphere ecosystem research was in the Yellowstone Park. Now, since between the 1920s and the 1970s, they essentially destroyed the wolf population of Yellowstone. That led to the elk population or the moose population, can't remember which one it is, just growing because there wasn't a natural predator. That depleted some of the ground covering growth that the moose would eat because there's too many of them. That led to surface level erosion because there was no longer vegetation to keep stuff in place. Now that's very similar to how an economy works. If you try to tinker with this thing, if you hunt out the middle class, if they're the wolves in this expansive metaphor, then it has this problem of leading to knock-on effects that you couldn't genuinely foresee. I mean, if I told you, hunting wolves to extinction will lead to topsoil, the erosion of fertile topsoil, you would call me, slightly weird. But that's the whole thing with an economic system, is you cannot look at it as something that can be managed from Pretoria, like a communist or a command control advocate does. Because what you're now doing here, I think the paraffin example is a very good one, but a further way in which the poorest of the poor are being clubbed under current circumstances is, I'm solidly middle class, I can't tell you when last I drove a significant distance, because the industry I'm in, middle class being I am, I could work from home. I don't have any costs attached to my traveling. And a large part of South Africa's middle class in the current circumstances have that privilege. But no poor people have that. You cannot clean a hospital or a home from your own home. You have to incur costs, and the government can try to price fix its way out of poverty by, exempting some goods from things like VAT. But then they are coming through it through another gap and just clupping the poor again, because for every sort of dodgy thing you change here, you destroy the topsoil somewhere else. And until South Africans understand that of the economy, then we really won't be able to hold the government to account. And that's what's happening here.
Indeed. Bheki, any final thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, this is really just an indication that the government's really not moving forward with any way of improving the lives of the average South African. There are these indicators that I read to sort of tell me that that the ANC really does not hold the South African lives into account. Like, they don't really think as to much what do these taxes impact them in any sense. Because it's quite evident at this point, we know which policies work and which policies don't work. We know that increases in taxes largely, to a large extent, impacts negatively on the poor, and to another extent encourages people to avoid taxes. So this is just another way of them to avoid the real issue, and the real issue is for them to commit towards reform. And this is something that's underplayed in the media as well, because the media has a sense that, Cyril can't do reform because he doesn't have a majority within his own party. But I think he does. He showed us this with the inquiry against the public protector, as well as that with Jacob Zuma, now Ismail Shuli. It's just that Cyril himself is not a reformer. And this new taxes on petrol is just an indication of that the ANC is really not moving towards any level of reform at all in the current stage.
Nick, if I could quickly add something there. A government in fiscal distress has 5 options, just 5 options to get more money, more assets: borrowing, higher taxes, cutting spending, printing money, or seizing assets. Those are the 5. There isn't an option beyond that. And if we look at the reality, they can't borrow because, we are already beyond junk status. So borrowing is not an avenue for us. They are trying to tax to gain revenue, but the South African taxpayer is immensely heavy taxed by global standards. I mean, it's just really harrowing. They cannot cut spending because there's not the political will, and the unions and the tripartite alliance, the tensions there cannot allow sufficient spending cuts of any note. There are attempts to get to the money printing stage by nationalizing the Reserve Bank. That's what's behind the Reserve Bank nationalization, make no mistake. And then there's the seizing of assets, and that's what's behind EWC. So it's really fascinating. We can no longer borrow because we've messed that up. We can no longer tax because we don't have a tax base anymore. We're eroding it faster than we can. There's instincts to print money, and there's this move to seize assets. So of the 5 options that the government can do, it's the one it hasn't touched is the only one that will make a difference, and that is cutting spending. But the problem is all the other 4 ones are either being ticked off because they're tested beyond breaking point, or they are in the pipeline, and that's why we must fight against these policies, because it really is a systematic attempt of a fiscally rotten government to bail itself out with your money.
Indeed. Let's move on to our last topic briefly. We've only got about 5 minutes to discuss it, but no stranger to controversy, Gauteng Education MEC Panyaza Lesufi he was giving a speech at a wreath laying ceremony and a commemoration ceremony of the struggle character Solomon Mahlangu. And during this, he made some remarks about what he sees as the dangers of having private education history curriculums. He said, quote, It can't be, comrades, that children of Orania will pass here, go to Voortrekker, and forget about Solomon Mahlangu. Children of those who oppressed us are the ones who should be here. Children of those who still deny what we sacrificed. We reconciled with them so this country can be free. Their children should be here so they can acknowledge the painful history of our country. But that will not happen so long as we have a separate curriculum for public education and a separate curriculum for private education. Those who want to run away from public education because we are teaching our children about Solomon Mahlangu, when they go to private education, they must find Albertina Sisulu, Beyers Naudé, and Sabelo Palmer. Bheki, what do you make of this criticism of the education system?
Well, the first point is that people are not running away from public schools because of the history of South Africa. They're running away because of the poor quality of those public schools. We look extensively at education levels in the country. We have a graph called the high school throughput, which tracks the cohort of grade 1 class in 2008 and follows them all the way to the matric until a maths pass rate of 50% and higher. And you'll find that at the end point, when they pass matric, only about 4.2% of the original class gets to get a qualification to go to university. So it is important that South Africans do know the history of South Africa. Someone that's well detailed this is by Walter E. Williams. It's a great book by Walter E. Williams called South Africa's Fight Against Capitalism, in which he described what the apartheid system was, which was a centrally planned government, which is a point often ignored in today's media. And once you realize that, and once you understand that, then you won't fall victim to the race-baiting narrative that we see in today's mainstream media as well as academic, with whenever someone comes with a level of reform, a race card is often played. That said, I do not think Panyaza Lesufi's objectives here are to educate South Africans. I think his objective here is to really interfere in private education, which is not his first. This is not his first time that he has done this.
Indeed. Herman, your thoughts? Oh, it's funny that you mentioned Walter Williams, because that's actually the second time he's been brought up in a row. We talked about him a little bit yesterday. Herman, please go ahead.
Yeah, I must say, if the ANC could focus more on education and less on re-education, I think South Africa would be able to avoid some of the communist failures that destroy civilization. But one thing that I want listeners of the podcast to take away from this is to understand how the other side really knows the battle of ideas. To control the feed of history is to control the narrative. It is to control the understanding of society around you. And that is the danger that we really should take away from this, is the battle of ideas is being fought by the other side with all the resources of the state, with all the power of the state. And we really are limited in our ability to push back. We do, and we've been doing that for 90 years. First against the one fire and then against the other fire, mostly because in between people didn't listen to the liberals. When the liberals said, don't push apartheid further, it will push Black South Africa into the hands of the communists, and voila. During the negotiation phase, 90s and 2000s, it was this idea, don't weaken oversight mechanisms on the government, and voila. So it's a tough gig to be a liberal in South Africa, because so often you have to say, well, you were told. But the thing that people must really take away from this is the battle of ideas being fought by the other side, using government, using the state, using your kids. And I think if you are not actively engaging in a counterinsurgency, then I think you are setting this country up for something of a terrible and tragic socialist failure.
Right. 2 points of clarification there. We mean liberal in the classical sense of the word, not in the corrupted American version of the word. And you, of course, mean counterinsurgency in the realm of ideas.
In the intellectual sense.
I know sometimes we have
violent sense.
Right. I know we have energetic people who watch us sometimes who own a lot of guns, who are sometimes keen to do something else, but that's not very helpful. Anyway, I think that's all the time we have for today. I just wanted to say, of course, George Orwell probably said it best in that he who controls the past controls the present. And that's definitely what Panyaza Lesufi understands, which is why he wants to make sure that ANC figures are revered in our history curriculum. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we will see you tomorrow for the next episode of the Daily Friend Show. Have a great day, everyone.